Hello, and welcome to Now Where Were We? A series of short videos about the history of Olympia, Lacey, and surrounding areas. Your host for this program is Deborah Ross. In this series, Deb takes us to locations that inform us about the history of our community. She also visits with local historians. We welcome your feedback and suggestions.
Hello, and welcome to Now Where Were We? An ongoing series of short videos about the history of Olympia, Lacey, and surrounding areas. I'm Deborah Ross, and this episode is launching our third season and also the beginning of a series of episodes called By the Decades. Each episode, we will be focusing on an event in a decade of our area's history. And we're starting with the very early arrival of Americans to our area in the 1840s. And to bring us into that period of time, I'm so pleased to have with me Don Trosper.
Well, hello, Deb.
Don is our go-to guy for Tumwater history, and today we are at Tumwater Falls Park. As you can see, it's been a pretty rainy season, and we have the magnificent falls behind us. And Don is going to talk about the very, very early history of Americans' arrival in our area. You'll also be able to see Don's ongoing series of videos about Tumwater history on Channel 26. And I always enjoy your episodes, Don, so thank you so much for coming today.
Well, thank you for having me. We'd like to welcome you to the first permanent American community in the state of Washington. The Tumwater is the very first. This was a British-controlled territory at the time the Simmons-Bush party arrived.
Well, so tell us a little bit about where we are and what's behind us here, Don.
Well, good. This is a monument honoring our founders. Michael T. Simmons was the leader of the group, and George Bush was the inspiration, I guess you'd say. The names are up here, Michael T. Simmons and his wife Elizabeth, and their kids were named after famous people of the time. George Washington Simmons, David Crockett Simmons, Francis Marion, McDonald, and then the first white child born north of the Columbia, they named Christopher Columbus Simmons. George Bush and his wife Isabella, he was part black, and his wife was white, and so the kids were all of mixed race. And then James McAllister and Martha and their kids were a part of that party also. And Gabriel Jones and his wife Keziah was also a part of that party and their kids. And David Kindred and his wife Talitha were the in-laws of Michael T. Simmons. Elizabeth's parents came with them. And then there were two young single guys on that Simmons-Bush party, Samuel Crockett and my relative, Jesse Ferguson.
What year did they start coming out here, Don?
Well, it was 1845, but they started on the Oregon Trail in the very early days of the Oregon Trail in 1844. And that was from St. Joseph, Missouri. They were all friends and neighbors in Clay County, Missouri. And so they decided to join a larger wagon train to come on out to the Oregon Territory. A lot of reasons for that. There was the patriotic reasons because it was manifest destiny. President Polk thought that we should stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So they were trying to bring settlers out on the Oregon Trail to, in that competition that we had with the British and the Hudson Bay Company for control of the Pacific Northwest. And so that was part of the reason, but also economic reasons. Being farmers in the Missouri and Mississippi valleys, it was difficult times economically, and they heard all these great stories about a new start out in this new country, and the climate was so mild you could throw a seed out your window and it would sprout. So those kind of things sounded very, very good to them. And then also because of George's race, it was pre-Civil War Missouri, and he saw the signs of the times, and racism was coming to a head. And so he thought maybe they could escape the racism of the states by coming way out into the wilderness and getting a new start. So those were the reasons they made that trip.
Now, you referred to Oregon Territory, but we're in Washington now, so what's the deal with that?
It was all one big territory. Northern Idaho, what's now Northern Idaho, and Washington and Oregon were all part of the Oregon Territory that the Lewis and Clark expedition laid pretty good claim to, we thought. And so, but the British also had a claim on it with the Hudson Bay Company. They were already established with Fort Vancouver on the Columbia and Fort Nisqually up here in Puget Sound. So there was a friendly competition and a treaty that we had between the two countries. But whoever brought out the most settlers and townspeople, were going to have a better claim to the land and control it.
Now, did the Simmons-Bush party come straight here to Tumwater?
Well, no, they were aiming for the American side, the Willamette Valley of the Oregon Territory, the south side of the river, the American side. If we were to take interstate highways between Tumwater and St. Joseph, Missouri, where they started, we could make that trip easily on the interstates in 3 days. It took them from May until almost December before they arrived in the Dalles, and then just half starved, and they're dressed in rags, and their oxen were tired and everything else. So it was quite the adventure, but they all survived the trip. But once they got to the Dalles, they sent one of the single guys of the wagon train ahead to the Willamette Valley to get some supplies and get information about what was going on the American side. And the news he brought back was they weren't going to be allowed to settle there because of George's race, part black, and anybody that tried to, people of color, would get periodic whippings. So he was in a quandary. What are we going to do? Go to the California under the protection of the Mexican government, or would it be to the north side, the British side, and get in good with Dr. McLaughlin at Fort Vancouver? And that was the decision they made under Simmons' leadership. And so they spent that first winter of 1844 and 45 splitting cedar shakes for the Hudson Bay Company to earn their keep.
Now, at some point, though, they came back down here to this area.
Yes. Dr. McLaughlin was commiserating, I guess you'd say, with their situation. They were people of obviously good character, and also with the race issues on the American side, the British were used to interracial relations with the Indian tribes and the Hawaiian workers they brought in, and the Chinese and the French, and it was just nothing to them to have mixed race dealings. And so they allowed the Simmons-Bush party to explore farther north that next spring of 1845. And so Simmons and a few of the young guys went down the Columbia and up the Cowlitz as far as they could go, which was a present-day town of Toledo in Lewis County, Cowlitz Landing they called it. And from there it was overland on an Indian footpath up to these very falls here that we see behind us, the Deschutes River. And then they explored the South Sound, and they decided that this was, Simmons' vision of a new market, the water-powered industry that could happen here. And so they went back south to the Columbia and got their families, and then made that trip that same year. By then it was fall, to come up the Cowlitz and Cowlitz Landing and slash their way through the October wet, cold, windy, rainy weather of western Washington. And Mrs. Simmons said of that whole Oregon Trail trip, that little section between what's now Toledo and Tumwater was the worst part of her whole life, and the worst part of that whole trip because of the rain and the wind and the 2.5 weeks of slashing through not a road but a trail, a path.
I seem to recall there were rumors of a mud mountain that you would have to cross over to get up to this area.
They had terrible swampland around Chehalis especially, and there were all kinds of legends about the depth of the swamps around there. So it was not an easy trip at all.
So what did Michael T. Simmons do when he arrived here?
Well, they had a letter of reference from Dr. McLaughlin to Fort Nisqually, and Dr. told me at Fort Nisqually, and the letter said to help them out and lend them the tools and seed they need, and help them out as you can, and also the local Indian tribes helped them with teaching them about eating off the land and so on. It's rich country, but they didn't know much, being from the Midwest, about things like gooey ducks and clams and oysters. That sounded pretty bad to them. So they had to learn from the Indian tribes and the British, and because of that help, they survived that first winter in a communal log cabin located somewhere near where Henderson House is located today. We're not sure of the exact location, but somewhere near that.
Now, my understanding is that Simmons had some experience as a miller and must have seen some potential in these magnificent falls behind us.
That's right, and that's why he decided to call the first name New Market, because he saw this as being a new market of a water-powered industry, grist mills and sawmills powered by all these waterfalls on the river. And so he immediately claimed the land around this river so he could start the mills. And his first thing was a grist mill down at the lower falls. And then soon after that, some other partners joined and they built a sawmill. And so they were, right from the beginning, a water-powered industry. And the name New Market didn't stick. That was the early settlers that came through No, that just didn't strike their fancy. So what they liked was the Chinook Indian language name for this area, which was Tumchuck, or noisy water. And so we Americanized that and called it Tumwater, and that name stuck.
All right. And so Michael T. Simmons established a mill here. What happened to George Bush?
Well, they were looking for land that they could farm right away, and that meant prairie land. So to the south of us, where now the Olympia Airport now is, was what's now called Bush Prairie. And so he didn't have to cut down trees and pull the stumps to have crops. He could plant right away. And he was a very successful rancher back in Missouri and continued that here. And he had a very rich, productive farm right away here in where now the Olympia Airport is.
You had mentioned earlier that there were laws against African Americans settling land in Oregon Territory. So how did George Bush end up owning land in this area?
Well, he had that farm established, but by that time we were in American territory, part of Oregon Territory then, and he still couldn't officially own his own farm, which was supporting all these early arrivals off the Cowlitz Trail. He was loaning tools and seed and advice and giving them, just generous men. I really admire the Bush family. And but those early settlers were really peeved at the American government that he couldn't own that land, that he was so helpful and helped develop this country. So they actually had to have an act of Congress. They went down to Longview, Kelso, called Monticello, and they made a petition to Congress to become a separate state from Oregon, or separate territory, I should say, and also that Bush would own his own farm. It took an act of Congress, but they did do it, and so he became an owner of his own farm. And he would have been proud later years. His oldest son, William Owen Bush, became one of the members of the first state legislature, and also helped form Washington State University, the Agricultural College, and was a great promoter of Washington Territory and later Washington State. And so the Bush family were very instrumental in our early history.
Yeah, among all the stories of any of the pioneers here, George Bush is the one that stands out to me as being a real saint and just a generous and
Yes.
a great farmer. And
yes, he had a very strong character, and everybody loved him and his whole family. They were just all inherited that nature, and so it's a good story. It is, in fact, in a real way, the state of Washington was formed because of racism in Oregon.
yeah, that's a good way to put it. Well, thank you so much, Don, for being here and telling us of some of the very earliest history of American settlement in what's now Washington State and our gorgeous Tumwater Falls Park. And do encourage people to come down and visit. There's wonderful walking trails and a native plant garden, all kinds of interesting things to see. So again, thank you.
Good, thank you too.